joy to be here, and I'm very, very grateful to you all for inviting me. It's the first time I've been on the March of the Living, and I wish I'd been before, but I shall certainly come again. And so in particular, I owe gratitude to John Farmer, who invited me, and to John Barrett, whom I've known before this week, who encouraged me to come, and it indeed is a remarkable and uplifting and extraordinary experience, and I shall try and bring my family next year. I'm not a lawyer, unlike my brilliant father, but he was, as you've heard from John Barrett's remarkable description of Nuremberg this morning, he was the chief British prosecutor, the British partner of the wonderful Robert Jackson. And I want to talk about a bit. I'm going to talk much less, you'll be glad to hear, than I would have done before I heard John Barrett, because he's covered so much of the ground so well. But I'm going to play you a recording. When I grew up in the 50s, and my father had old gramophone records, 78 RPM gramophone records, which are very fragile, of his speeches at Nuremberg, and I used to listen to them with macabre fascination and horror. And I'm going to play you one extract from them in a little bit. I just want to say also, I think the reason that John invited me was because of this book, which I wrote 4 years ago, called Justice and the Enemy, Nuremberg 9/11 and the Trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I wrote this because my publisher suggested to me when Obama came into office in January 2009 and said he was going to close Guantanamo and move the trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to New York, and immediately got into trouble with Congress and with the people of New York. My publisher said, look, William, your father was the British prosecutor at Nuremberg. Why don't you do a short, sharp book saying Nuremberg was how we gave justice to the monsters then, how should we do it to the Nazi monsters then, how should we do it to the Islamist monsters today? And I thought that was a very interesting idea, and I wrote this book, and John Barrett was incredibly helpful to me. So I'm very grateful to him. I want to talk briefly about Nuremberg, and Obama studied Nuremberg in law school. And in 2008, when he was, throughout his presidential campaign, he criticized Guantanamo and the military tribunals there. And he praised Nuremberg, saying, part of what makes us different was even after those Nazis had performed atrocities that no one had ever seen before, we still gave them a day in court, and that taught the entire world about who we were, but also about the basic principles of the rule of law. Well, as we know, those Nazis were indeed given their day in court, and I think it was an extremely valuable process, despite the criticisms and the controversy that Nuremberg aroused at the time. It's much less controversial today. But that court, remember, was a military tribunal, as the United States created in Guantanamo after 9/11, with very unique procedures, very different from any domestic court in the USA or Britain. That's not to diminish it, it's just to say that it was unique. And I think that Guantanamo also, as you know, is extremely controversial in the way that Nuremberg was at the beginning. But I would argue, and this book argues, that actually the United States has created another form of tribunal or court that is perfectly legitimate in the trying of a new kind of war, the war on terror, which may not have been a brilliant name, but a war in which we are enjoined today. I don't want to compare it to Nazism in any way, but I just want to, and I will come to that briefly later. But as I say, and as John said this morning, the attitudes of the Allies were very mixed in 1943 and 44 and 45. Stalin just wanted to kill everybody, every German he could get hold of. Churchill wanted to kill a few, the leaders anyway. He was frightened that a trial would be challenged and it would go on forever. He was wrong about that. Hans Morgenthau, the US Treasury Secretary, argued in 1944 to Roosevelt that the quick execution of the Nazi leaders was the best solution, and that Germany should be pastoralized, in quotes, so that Germany could never grow again as a strong industrial power, able to wage war as it had been able to do both in 1914 and 1939. Roosevelt heard him out. He was his Treasury Secretary. But by the time Roosevelt died, he had come round to the idea of a tribunal, which Truman accepted. Churchill was still against it. But he too was persuaded by Jackson when Jackson, soon after the end of the war, came to London and did this extraordinary thing. On the wreckage of the continent, he led the creation of the tribunal that became known as Nuremberg and took place at Nuremberg. It was an extraordinary achievement. My father, as John mentioned, was the new Attorney General after Churchill was defeated in the summer of 1945, with most of the troops voting for a change and for a Labour government. He was elected to Parliament that summer, and was the most prominent lawyer who the Labour Party had. And Attlee immediately made him Attorney General, and he immediately, therefore, joined Jackson at the London Conference, which took place, as John said, at Church House, and went to Nuremberg and was at Nuremberg a lot of the time, except for the fact that as Attorney General, he had to be back in London much of the time as well. So David Maxwell Fyfe, his deputy, undertook a lot of the cross-examinations. When the trial opened, the speed of the thing is quite extraordinary. The war ended in early May 1945. The trial opened in Nuremberg in November 1945, and it closed in July 1946. And there were no appeals against the judgments, unlike today and unlike in any domestic courts and indeed in Guantanamo. The most absorbing, the most horrific figure of the leader of the Germans in the docks was Hermann Goering, Reichsmarshal Goering, who dominated the proceedings in an extraordinary way. He was a wicked but very clever man and a very flamboyant man with an exaggerated sense of himself. He gave himself up in May 1945 in Salzburg and arrived there with hundreds of beautiful uniforms, which he had still brought with him. And he brought a red hat box, 16 monogrammed suitcases, a fabulous collection of rings, watches, medals, and cufflinks, his valet, Robert Krupp, and thousands of paracodeine tablets, to which he was totally addicted. And he was grossly overweight when he arrived, not a pretty sight when asked to stand naked for a medical examination, with scarlet toenails as well as scarlet fingernails. In detention and on prison foods through the summer of 1949, his health improved greatly. And his morale and his ability to dominate all the other fellows in the court, other fellow defendants in the court, was quite extraordinary. The judges decided that he should represent the accused in being allowed to respond at length to the more general and perhaps more political aspects of the trial. He was therefore constantly in the witness box, 9 whole days. And one of the British judges, Norman Burkitt, put it this way: "Throughout this trial, the dead Hitler has been present at every such session, but Goering is the man who has dominated the proceedings." Now, I mentioned that I wanted to play you a couple of minutes of my father's speech, for the closing speech for the prosecution. This was a record I listened to a lot. It had the strange word Dubno written on it in ink by my father, and Dubno was a town in the Ukraine. And it describes such awful things that I could not possibly imagine at the age of 10 how my father saw these things. But he was in fact quoting from the diary of a German engineer stationed in the Ukraine who witnessed the appalling atrocities that happened there, some of them. His name was Hermann Graeber. Can we start?
Let Graeber speak again of Dubno. The people who had got off the trucks, men, women, and children of all ages, had to undress upon the orders of an SS man who carried a riding or dog whip. They had to put down their clothes in fixed places, sorted according to shoes, top clothing, and underclothing. I saw a heap of shoes of about 800 to 1,000 pairs. Great piles of underlinen and clothing. Without screaming or weeping, these people undressed, stood around in family groups, kissed each other, said farewells, and waited for a sign from another SS man who stood near the pit, also with a whip in his hand. During the 15 minutes that I stood near, I heard no complaint or plea for mercy. I watched a family of about 8 persons, a man and a woman, both about 50, with their children of about 1, 8, and 10, and 2 grown-up daughters of about 20 or 24. An old woman with snow-white hair was holding the 1-year-old child in her arms and singing to it and tickling it. The child was cooing with delight. The couple were looking on with tears in their eyes. The father was holding the hand of a boy about 10 years old and speaking to him softly. The boy was fighting his tears. The father pointed to the sky, stroked his head, and seemed to explain something to the boy. At that moment, the SS man at the pit shouted something to his comrade. The latter counted off about 20 persons and instructed them to go behind the earth mound. Among them was the family, which I have mentioned. I well remember a girl, slim and with black hair, who, as she passed close to me, pointed to herself and said, 23. I walked around the mound and found myself confronted by a tremendous grave. People were closely wedged together and lying on top of each other so that only their heads were visible. Nearly all had blood running over their shoulders from their heads. Some of the people shot were still moving. Some were lifting their arms and turning their heads to show that they were still alive. I was surprised that I was not ordered away. You were asked to believe that these 21 ministers and leading officers of state did not know of these matters, were not responsible. It is for you to decide. Some, it may be, are more guilty than others. Some played a more direct and active part than others in these frightful crimes. But when these crimes are such as you have to deal with here, slavery, mass murder, and world war, when the consequences of these crimes are the deaths of over 20 million of our fellow men, the devastation of a continent, the spread of untold tragedy and suffering throughout the world, what mitigation is it that some took less part than others, that some were principals and others mere accessories? What matters it if some forfeited their lives only 1,000 times when others deserved 1,000,000 deaths? In one way, the fate of these men means little. Their personal power for evil lies forever broken. They have convicted and discredited each other and finally destroyed the legend they created around the figure of their leader. But on their fate, great issues must still depend, for the ways of truth and righteousness between the nations of the world, the hope of future international cooperation in the administration of law and justice are in your hands. This trial must form a milestone in the history of civilization, not only bringing retribution to these guilty men, not only marking that right shall, in the end, triumph over evil, but also that the ordinary people of the world, and I make no distinction now between friend and foe, are now determined that the individual must transcend the state. The state and the law are made for man, that through them he may achieve a fuller life, a higher purpose, a greater dignity. states may be great and powerful, ultimately the rights of men, made as all men are made in the image of God, are fundamental. When the state, either because as here its leaders have lusted for power and place, or under some specious pretext that the end may justify the means, affronts these things, they may for a time become obscured and submerged, but they are imminent, and ultimately they will assert themselves more strongly still, their imminence more. Liberty, love, understanding comes to this court and cries, "These are our laws, let them prevail."
Quite a good speech. It was very extraordinary to listen to as a child. In the final judgment at Nuremberg, mercy was shown, despite the horrors that my father described. 3 defendants were acquitted altogether, 7 were sentenced to long periods of imprisonment, and 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. The death sentences were carried out on the night of October the 16th, 1946, on all except Goering, whose son Tao cheated the hangman by crushing a vial of cyanide between his teeth. I think that the trial has had an extraordinary impact upon the world for the good. Rebecca West, the great writer, said, "Of course the trial was botched and imperfect. How could it be anything else? It took place within the same year as Germany's defeat." It's extraordinary, the speed of it. But she concluded that the judgment at Nuremberg was a sort of legalistic prayer that the kingdom of heaven should be with us. It was perhaps predictable that that prayer could not be fulfilled. Hannah Arendt agreed. After the Eichmann trial, she wrote, "Even today, our knowledge of the Nazi regime rests in large part on the material gathered, all the material gathered for prosecutions." Now, it just seems almost pathetic to switch from that to what's happening with Islamic radicalism today. And I just want to say, but I think that just as Nuremberg was designed as a vehicle to anathemize men imbued with evil, we should always remember, and we see it today, that evil is eternal and reinvents itself in every age. In the 1940s, we confronted and with immense sacrifice defeated the horror of fascism. The scale and the nature of the threats are different today, but the ideology of Al-Qaeda and its Islamist associates shares attributes with Nazism. It too is totalitarian, and it too has anti-Semitism at its core. In the case of Al-Qaeda, that intransigent hatred is extended to all infidels. In the case and just as Hitler planned a 1,000-year Reich, so the Islamists call for a global caliphate, in which they and their laws prevail absolutely and endlessly. I was going to talk about Guantanamo in more detail, but I think I've already held your attention kindly enough. And I would just finish a quotation from Ayatollah Khomeini, who really says the same thing. When he was president of Iran, after the appalling revolution in 1979 in Iran, which was the start of the horrific terror with which the world has been faced ever since, Khomeini said, "If one allows the infidels to continue playing their role of corruptors on earth, their eventual moral punishment will be all the stronger. To allow the infidels to stay alive means to allow them to do more corrupting. To kill them is a surgical operation commanded by Allah, the Creator." Now, I would just refer back finally to Justice Jackson, who, in a way, Khomeini's words remind one of his description of Hitler as a mad messiah who started the war without cause and prolonged it without reason. And Jackson also said, and I think this refers to our lives today as well as when he said it, he said, "Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive. Thank you.